Welcome to a brand new edition of the Taiwan Outlook. I'm your host, Raymond Wu. On today's program, we're delighted to have a very special guest who's a well-established foreign journalist in Taiwan, a leading advocate on English education in Taiwan, and also a very good friend of mine, Mr. Jeffrey Mindich. Jeffrey, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Raymond. Glad to be here.
Yes, Jeffrey, maybe we can start off today's program by telling the viewers back home a little bit about yourself. Why and when did you first come to Taiwan? And so far, your experience and impression of the island.
Well, when I came to Taiwan, I don't know my memory is that good. I know it was sometime after the Republic.
Okay.
When I got here, it was definitely the martial law era. So I've
okay.
been here quite a while, actually. And my university major in the U.S. was Chinese studies, and my original plan had been to go from the U.S. to China. And at that time, of course, it was still quite closed China, and I came here first. I thought I'd look around here and maybe make it a springboard to China, and I never took the jump.
So you basically came to Taiwan to learn Mandarin, to learn Chinese.
Well,
I
knew some Chinese before I got here.
In the U.S.
It was actually kind of funny because, you know, when you're studying in the U.S., you have the opportunity more to learn written, you know, and read Chinese than spoken, because you don't have the opportunity to speak. So when I got out of the airport, when I first got here at the Taoyuan airport, and I got into the cab driver couldn't understand when I told him where I wanted to go, so I had to write it down. And he's thinking, well, this is very strange. There's, you know, people who are illiterate who can't read and write, but you don't really run into somebody who can't speak but who can write. So I ended up having to write down on a piece of paper where I wanted to go. So my Chinese language skills were definitely not prime when I first got here.
No. You're very modest. I know that you speak Mandarin very well. And would you tell us a little bit about your learning experience in terms of picking up the language a little more after your arrival in Taiwan?
Well, you know, it's funny. I never really felt... I know some people say, you know, Chinese is the most difficult language in the world because basically you've got a spoken language and you've got a written language. But I've never really, for some reason, it's never struck me as a difficult language. And I know there's a lot of, for example, some of the National Teachers University, they have classes in Chinese and people go to learn how to read the newspapers. And I never went through any of that. I just kind of picked up the newspaper and I started reading. So don't ask me why, but Chinese has come, Mandarin has come much easier to me than
to most other people.
Yes.
Yeah. And when you first got here, what were your general impression of the island? You know, I mean, that was something like 20-some years ago. And you know, what did you think about Taiwan at the time, given the fact that it was still under martial law?
Well, you know, it's funny. When I came here, I didn't have a real sense of politics. In fact, you know, several years later, when I used to go back to the U.S. and tell people I was in Taiwan, people would say, "Oh yeah, Thailand, I know where that is." So,
exactly, that happened with me too when I tell people I came from Taiwan.
So I mean, I have to admit, I knew more than the average American when I first got here, but I wasn't really fully clued in on the intricacies of martial law and the political system, but I did, you know, it's interesting, I was recently in Vietnam, and, you know, traveling through the countryside in Vietnam, a lot of the stuff I saw there reminded me of Taiwan 20-something years ago, the small villages and whatnot, and of course, you know, when I left the States, we were in the middle of this big organic and health movement, and everything needed to be handmade and homemade. And remember when I first got here in Tianmu, there was a big sign on one store, and it said "machine-made bread."
You know, that was a big step.
That was a big step to Taiwan. So I mean, it was a very laid-back type of a place than by comparison, and certainly it's seen you know, tremendous progress in the last 2 decades.
And where did that, you know, window of opportunity came when you decided to become a journalist in Taiwan, and how did that, you know, come about?
Okay. Well, actually, I never really intended to be a journalist. Never. It was the farthest thought from my mind. I was teaching Chinese history and geography at a local school for overseas Chinese. And I was writing on Chinese and Taiwanese culture for a local magazine that was done by the local government information office.
GIO, yes.
And my writing was fairly well known, but I wasn't a journalist. And International Community Radio Taipei, ICRT,
ICRT,
which used to be the former Armed Forces radio station when the U.S. troops were still here, was later taken over by a foundation. They came to me and they said, hey, we have a grant to do a program on the environment.
Okay.
And are you interested in writing and producing it? And I didn't really see it as a journalistic aspect at the time.
Okay.
And they knew I had good writing skills. They had a grant. Do you want to come do this? And I said, that sounds interesting. Okay. And then somehow I kind of got convinced by them, well, why don't you just give us a few hours more of your time a week, and we'll put you on a full-time salary, and we'll make you you can be a journalist as well, covering the environment. So I really stepped into my journalistic career very unexpectedly. So I began by covering environmental news, and then doing this program on the environment, which was called Eye on the Environment, not me, Eye on the Environment. It was actually nominated for a Golden Bell.
Oh,
so
terrific.
So
and also, I remember back in the 80s, the concern over the environment, over the consumer rights, movement in Taiwan was also very, very big. That was the time when you first saw the initial emergence of the so-called civil society in Taiwan, when the different individuals and groups become very energized and try to pay more attention to the environment, to the causes of health, to protection of consumer rights. Was that also part of the reason why this journalistic career just took off really fabulously?
Well, I thought it was very exciting at the time because politics. Everybody saw that as headline news, but the environment, I mean, for the first time, Taiwan had started an environmental protection agency. And in those days, when Taiwan was forging its economic miracle, basically you could pour anything you wanted into the rivers, you could, put anything you wanted out into the air. Growth first. And little by little, people started to realize, well, you have to breathe the air and you have to drink the water. And so, this environmental beginning of an environmental conscience started. And so it was a very exciting time to be involved with environmental journalism in Taiwan. And, we had the opportunity to go to a lot of places that were in the process of going through growing pains, companies that were going through growing pains, transition to having to deal with environmental issues. And
regulations and things.
And of course, there were political issues as well. I remember in those days, it was very hard to close a factory for pollution because the factory always knew somebody. And so I remember back in those days, Zhao Xiaokang, the former lawmaker, was the chief of the environmental administration. And he called us all for a big lunch. And there was this very big polluting paper factory that had all kinds of connections, and he couldn't shut it down. So he came that day with an envelope, and he held the envelope up and he said, I have in this envelope a list of all of the people who were trying to stop me from shutting down this plant. If tomorrow the plant is still open, I give all of you a copy of the list. The next day, that plant was shut down.
It's close. So the media power does come to life.
That was the first time ever that a plant, a factory, had actually been shut down in China for an environmental violation. So it was a very exciting time to be an environmental reporter.
And also at the time, I think Taiwan is also going through that transitional period, like you and I just discussed, going from a more authoritarian government, into more pluralistic, open, society, and also, environment. I'm sure wasn't the only issue that you covered that you were concerned with.
Oh, of course not. Of course not.
What were the other, topics that you were assigned to, or you took the initiative of getting involved with?
By my own, personal thing, I was always very interested in health, consumer issues, the environment. I mean, I found politics mildly boring, to be honest, because to me it always seemed that if I think of myself as a TV viewer or a radio listener, I'm most interested in the things that affect my life.
Quality of life issues.
Directly. And, for me, consumer issues, health issues, the environment. And that's not to me, when there were big street protests by the opposition, I went out and covered those as well. And I, because I thought that was an important part of Taiwan's democratic development. But on a day-to-day basis, I was very happy to be doing things that I felt were relevant to the listening or viewing audience's daily lives.
Were there any memorable and very exciting experiences in terms of covering and reporting news in Taiwan that you can remember?
Well, I mean, certainly some of the street protests by the opposition, especially
that was back in the 80s.
Back in the 80s. Well, actually, when I was involved with ICRT, it was the early 90s, but it was still, the level of democratization was still relatively low. I mean, it was the late 80s when martial law was finally lifted, but even after the lifting, it wasn't as if the
things changed overnight.
No. And the other thing that I got involved with later was news anchoring all of the major election coverage. And it was very interesting to see how Taiwan's opposition went from being a party that had no choice but to jump on top of tables and rip out microphones to actually little by little starting to become very animated. Well, because they really had such a small minority even when there were free elections. And I remember we were involved in covering the first elections of the National Assembly, because, I mean, for years the National Assembly had been frozen in place, and they were starting to have free elections of the legislature, free elections of the National Assembly, and we were involved in doing live coverage and analysis of all of those elections, and I would say those were really pivotal events in Taiwan's democracy.
For the long-term development of Taiwan.
You know, now we see a kind of static situation, but I mean, in those days, when the opposition could grab 30% in the legislature, that was considered a major...
big news.
Big news,
exactly. I remember one of the arguments at the time was over, democratic reforms on one hand, and also on the other, the rule of law. We need to have order. What was the general impression among the foreign journalist community, over this debate?
Well, I think foreign journalists have always had the idea that democracy in some ways tends to moderate itself. I mean, there was some growing pains for Taiwan's democracy and some chaos, but, people forget what U.S. politics was like 200 years ago. I mean, people used to shoot each other.
That's right.
There used to be fistfights on the floor of the Congress. So, I mean, a lot of what you saw in Taiwan really wasn't unique to Taiwan in terms of beginning development of a democracy. So I think Taiwan did a pretty good job
in terms of
moderating rule of law. I mean, if you think about it, in the year 2000, you had a transition of power in Taiwan, a bloodless. And you didn't see, I mean, you look at what's going on politically in other countries, and actually Taiwan's evolution to democracy has been quite a smooth process. Smooth and peaceful process, absolutely.
Other than, Jeffrey's journalistic experiences, after we come back, after this short break, we're going to talk with Jeffrey about his experiences as a leading advocate of English education in Taiwan, making Taiwan more international. We'll be right back.